this morning comes from Philippians chapter 1. We're going to be reading verses 15 through the beginning of 18. If you're using Pew Bibles to follow along, it's page 1826. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so in love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this, I rejoice.
Good morning. Good morning. Well, in case you can't tell from the slides and from the reading, we're in the book of Philippians now. And before we really get into it, I want to encourage you to also go home and study this book on your own. You know, just as in the last sermon series with the story and the books we gave you, we wanted you to engage the scriptures yourself as well. And not just listen to what I have to say about it, but to study it for yourself. And so I want you to go home and read Philippians for yourself. It is such a good book. And there's some great resources out there. There's something called the Listener's Commentary on Philippians. You can find it and listen to it for free. It is a great resource that I rely on. And there's other commentaries and easily accessible books. Just, don't just take my word for it. Really study Scripture yourself. Now, I have a bit of a confession. Sometimes I think about myself a little bit too much, or maybe a lot too much. I mean, I can see my wife smiling, and I don't know how I feel about that. I have a real tendency to dwell on my circumstances in that moment. You know, if I'm in the middle of a disagreement with someone, it's all I can think about. Or, life is so expensive, these bills, I can't afford to go buy that thing that I want that I don't really need, and I'll get down on it. Or one that really bugs me is I have plans, and then they change on me suddenly. And then I get really annoyed about that and have a hard time moving past it for a while. Sadly, I have a problem with really letting circumstances affect my mood. You know, there are times where I will get mopey and moody when something goes unexpected. Or, my wife could tell you I'll get kind of grumpy, maybe even snappy. Or I'll disengage and kind of be in my own head and just ignore my family and just focus too much on myself and on my circumstances. And sometimes I take those things way too seriously. And maybe some of it comes from my struggle with OCD that I've mentioned in the past, but I think more of it comes from a problem with self-centeredness than anything else. I just think too much about myself. Can anybody relate? I would be really surprised if most of us at least sometimes don't experience these struggles with thinking about our own circumstances more than we should. You know, emotions are powerful things. And while we don't want to completely ignore them, it's easy to be consumed by them. And by worries about money and our relationships and our jobs and just letting it really get to us. Sometimes it is really hard to look past our current circumstances. But Paul really seems to somehow manage to look past his circumstances, quite well. He almost makes it seem easy. he always has a unique perspective on his situation. And this is a man who has been stoned and beaten and imprisoned for talking about Jesus. I mean, people challenge him, they say bad things about him, and they even try to kill him. So if anyone is qualified to talk to us about having the proper perspective on our circumstances, I think it's Paul. And Paul writes this letter to the Philippian church that we started last week. While he is a prisoner, he writes about his situation with a remarkably positive perspective. You know, he's under house arrest, as I've mentioned before, and he's forced to provide for himself. Can't really do that while under house arrest. And so the believers of Philippi send him this gift with Epaphroditus to help him out. And Paul writes them this letter of friendship and thanksgiving. And you know, it's been a while since they've really heard from him, and people are probably wondering how he's doing. So he takes this opportunity while writing this letter to provide an update, to tell them about the situation. And in the section we're going to be in today, if you want to turn to it while I'm still talking, Philippians 1:12 to the first half of verse 18, Paul offers a sort of news report. But it really becomes so much more than a news report. He actually ends up modeling for the church the kinds of things that he's going to call them to do in the rest of the letter. He actually uses his own circumstances and his perspective on them as an example for how the Philippians should view their own circumstances. Now he says right away, we're going to look at the first little bit, verses 12 through 14, where he talks about gospel advancement. And right away in verse 12, he says, you know, my circumstances have actually turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. Philippians 1:12 says, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that my situation has actually turned out to advance the gospel. The word advance there, or in many translations, progress, carries this heavy idea of to advance in spite of obstacles. You know, I heard a great illustration here where a man named John Whitaker said, you know, think about those movies where you see people in the jungle, in the Amazon, they have a machete, they're trying to get somewhere, there's no path, and they're just trying to hack their way through. And it is slow going, but they are making progress in spite of those obstacles. You know, Ruth might have experienced something like this over in New Guinea, or, you know, just trying to make her own path through the jungle. I don't know. Maybe ask her about it. But it's kind of like that. You know, there are these heavy obstacles in the way, but he's just pushing his way forward in spite of them. Now, Paul, a traveling apostle, is in prison. You know, talk about an obstacle, right? This is almost comparable to a concert pianist having his hands tied behind his back and then being told, hey, go play a show. How can he possibly do what he's been called to do? Well, Paul says, contrary to what you might actually think, my imprisonment for preaching the gospel has actually helped to advance the gospel. Mind blown for me, right? We should really pay attention from this point forward that in his update about himself, it actually turns into, instead of telling about how he's doing, telling how the gospel's doing. Paul is so caught up in the gospel and in his vocation, his calling to preach the gospel, that it seems as though if the gospel's doing well, he's doing well, even if his personal circumstances aren't great. And so now Paul goes on to say in verses 13 through 14, there are two ways that my imprisonment have helped to advance the gospel. So verses 13 to 14 say, the whole imperial guard and everyone else knows that I am in prison for the sake of Christ. And most of the brothers and sisters, having confidence in the Lord because of my imprisonment, now more than ever dare to speak the word fearlessly. So Paul says the first way my imprisonment has helped advance the gospel is that my reason for being imprisoned has become well known. You know, he is imprisoned for the sake of Christ. He is imprisoned for his connection with Jesus. And it has become well known throughout the imperial guard and everyone else. This is, as I've said before, this is likely Paul's Roman imprisonment. And we think this partly because of this reference to the imperial guard, or the praetorium, which referred to the emperor's elite troops that were stationed primarily in Rome and carried out specific tasks on behalf of the emperor, which included guarding special prisoners like Paul. And so now we have to remember, Paul is in house arrest, which means he also has a guard chained to him day and night. We read about that in Acts. And Paul, he receives a lot of visitors. You know, different people from the church coming to visit him, and people from the Jewish synagogue coming to hear about what he has to say, what this gospel is. You know, and so Paul has this guard chained to him who would be forced to listen to him explaining the gospel. They'd be forced to listen to him walking through scriptures and explaining Jesus as the Messiah and his death and resurrection. You know, knowing Paul, he probably would have viewed this guard as a captive audience who can't get away from him. You know, and they'd be forced to listen to him explaining why Jesus is the king. Now, something to understand is the soldiers would have been used to what you could call the gospel of Caesar. You know, the supposed good news that this new emperor had taken the throne and was bringing, or so he claimed, peace and justice to the world. Now, Paul comes along, and he's announcing that there's a different gospel, a better, truer gospel. This Jesus of Nazareth has taken the throne of the world and is now calling everyone, including the emperor, to bow their knee to him. Needless to say, the imperial guard would have been pretty shocked by this. They would have been very incredulous. Now imagine what happens when the guard duty changes. The guard on shift with Paul gets swapped out with a new guard, and they go back to the barracks. Can you imagine what he's going to say to the other guards? You know, I'm guarding this Jewish prisoner who actually thinks that this Jewish rabbi that was executed under Pilate 30 years ago is risen from the dead and is the real king of the world. I mean, doesn't that sound crazy? And can you imagine the gossiping and maybe the laughing and you know, maybe the thinking about it in the quiet hours too. You know, Paul doesn't say that they're coming to faith, but he says they all know about it. And, you know, and guards, they gossip, and so it spreads. And on top of that, he says not just the guards, but everyone else. And that probably refers to the members of the emperor's household, where the Praetorian Guard would have been primarily stationed. So they're going back to the barracks, they're talking about what Paul said. And they're talking about what Paul said when they're on duty in the palace with the servants and things. They're spreading this because it's so strange, right? And so you can't help but talk about it. And so Paul says, the news about the Messiah has spread in the very heart of the empire. in the headquarters, the nerve center of the empire, these people are learning about why Paul's in prison. They are learning this gospel. Whether they believe it or not, they all know about it now. And so Paul says there's also a second way that this imprisonment has helped to spread the gospel or to further its advancement. And that is because people are becoming more courageous about speaking the word of God. He says in verse 14 that his imprisonment has inspired the believers in Rome to share the word. He said, you can just see them thinking, well, if Paul's in prison for it and he can't preach it right now, well, I could certainly tell my neighbor about it. If Paul's in prison and can't preach, I could certainly tell the other ladies when I go to the laundromat. Or if Paul can't preach and is in prison for it, I can certainly tell the other guys at the public bath or at the gym, or when I'm shopping in the marketplace or the grocery store. Paul's imprisonment has stirred the believers up and given them confidence and faith in Jesus. He says they have far more courage to share the gospel. In many translations, in the one I use, it's fearlessness. It literally means they are far more daring. They are far more daring in speaking the word. They are taking greater risks to speak the message about Jesus. And then Paul goes on in verses 15 to 18 to say, there is something kind of negative happening, but he refuses to let it discourage him or change his attitude. So we'll start with verses 15 to 17, which read, "Some, to be sure, are preaching Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do so from love, because they know I am placed here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, because they think they can cause trouble for me in my imprisonment. Some people are preaching the gospel with bad motives, and some with good motives." Paul says the people with the bad motives are preaching out of envy and rivalry, out of selfish ambition and strife. This rivalry. And the people with good motives are doing it out of goodwill. They do it out of love for Paul and Jesus and the gospel, and they have good hearts and good motives. And then he goes on to say, back to those guys with the bad motives, preaching out of rivalry, it's selfish ambition. They're doing it to try and cause me distress. Selfish ambition literally means rivalry. And this word is used very often in the political context in Paul's day to describe rival parties. It's used to describe the way rival parties are always working an angle to get ahead and put the other party down, using someone's negative circumstances to their own advantage. So he uses that word of these people. They are like that rival political party. They are trying to use my negative circumstances to their own advantage. Maybe they want to make Paul feel bad that they're out there preaching and he can't be. Or maybe they want to make Paul feel bad that their reputation and their following is growing, but his isn't. But you know what? Paul says it's not working. He has the most amazing response. He says in verse 18, "What is the result? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is being proclaimed, and in this I rejoice." Paul says, so what? What now? What's the result? They have this selfish ambition. They're trying to hurt me, and they're preaching the gospel as a way to hurt me, but so what? I mean, how would we respond? If someone's out there doing something, and they're trying to cause you distress, how would you respond? Would you say, so what? I mean, I wish that I could say that I would. But that's hard. Paul, however, says, you know what, so what? It doesn't cause me any distress. It only matters to me that Jesus is being proclaimed. I don't care who gets the credit, and I don't care about their reason for proclaiming Jesus. I just care that they're proclaiming him. And Paul says he will rejoice that people are learning about Jesus. Now, think about that for a second. He cares so much about the gospel that he just doesn't care about his own circumstances or about people trying to hurt him. I have some more to say about that, but we're running out of time. So I'm just going to say, Paul used his own circumstances to model the perspective and attitude that he wants the Philippian church to have, and by extension, for us to have. He models it in two ways. First, he has a greater concern for the well-being of the gospel than for his own well-being. And that's what he wants for us. When Paul describes his circumstances, they are all tied up in the gospel. If the gospel's doing well, so is he. And he wants the Philippian church, and he wants us to have that same mindset. If the gospel is being advanced, even if things are difficult or challenging for us, let's rejoice that it's going well. Are you maybe at a job where you are having the opportunity, or some other situation, maybe not your job, some relationship, something, where you have the opportunity to share the gospel? To pray with someone, to talk about Jesus, maybe even hand out a Bible or give some godly advice. But the job or the situation, whatever it may be, is just awful. Do you have a bad attitude maybe because you're more concerned with your own well-being in that situation than with the gospel's well-being? Because that is not what Paul's modeling. And I can tell you right now, that's been my experience in many jobs. One of my last jobs before being hired by the church was as a mechanic. And I was surrounded by a lot of people, rough people, who talked in a lot of, in ways that I would never want to repeat. But God came up a fair bit, and I actually had a lot of opportunities to talk about God. But rather than rejoicing that I had the chance to share the gospel, I struggled with, this environment's hard, this is difficult. I was more worried about my own well-being than the well-being of the gospel, and that is not what Paul models. Paul says the opposite. Be more concerned about the well-being of the gospel than yourself. If we learn Paul's lesson, we can have a positive attitude because the gospel is advancing, even if the job or the situation is unpleasant, the people are difficult to be around, the boss is horrible, or the company is terribly run. If the gospel... Now, something for us to think about is, in those situations, if the gospel's not advancing, why not? Now, a second thing Paul modeled was an unwillingness to be angered or moved to personal vengeance by people's proud, selfish, or even anti-Paul or anti-me motives. Paul says they may be out to get me, but they're preaching Jesus, and I'm happy about that, and I rejoice. Now, this doesn't mean he just sits and takes it for no reason. I'm fairly sure if Paul had an opportunity to sit down and speak with his people, he would probably challenge them and call out their motives in some way. But he is not going to get worked up by it or develop a personal vendetta or a grudge because they've spoken badly about him. We need to develop Paul's attitude. When we do a lot of work in a ministry or in our jobs and someone else stands up and takes the credit, or when we work hard and are volunteering and giving our time at the church or somewhere else, and someone steps in and takes the credit, we don't get noticed, but they do, and we're the ones doing all the work. Or people are talking about you behind your back at work. Did you hear about so-and-so? Did you hear about Bruce? Did you hear about Vern? Did you hear about Ross? Did you hear about Leslie? They keep talking about Jesus. They're kind of weird. They keep talking about God's love and his forgiveness. They should really just keep that to themselves. Maybe let's make their lives hard. Let's give them a hard time. Or let's get them in trouble at work for talking about Jesus. Those people are complaining. But Jesus is still being talked about. So, what should you do there? Should you be upset and hold a grudge that they're talking badly about you? Or rejoice that they're thinking about Jesus? All those things happen. And Paul says, let's not care about who gets the credit or how it affects us or what people might say about us. Let's care about the gospel being preached. And so in closing, I have one final statement for you. Let's make our lives all tied up in the gospel, just like Paul's, so that when the gospel is doing well, we are doing well.